The cold wind of November swept across the flat, open fields of Iowa as a long freight train rumbled into the newly constructed military outpost known as Millsfield Camp. Painted in dull olive green and coated with dust from the long journey westward, the train resembled a metal serpent coiled with secrets. As it hissed to a stop, the silence that followed felt heavier than the engine's roar. Dozens of soldiers stood at attention, rifles slung across their backs, watching as the doors of the lead car began to slide open with a metallic groan.
Ein bei ein, 12 deutschen Frauen steppten down auf den frosenen Gravel. Sie wurden reguläre grähe Auxiliaruniformen, creased und tired von days on the road. Der Boots kranschte auf den frostbittenden Ground, deren Expressionen unlesbar. Most of them waren jung, bärlich aus deren 20, deren Cheeks hollowed durch die Monotonie von Travel und den Stress von Unsicherheit. Die Women kept close, moving instinktiv als ein Unit, der Eyes scannen die Surroundings für Seinen von Hostilität oder Command.
They had been told many things, that America would treat them like animals, that the camps would be brutal, unsanitary, and unrelenting, that the guards were cruel and the food barely edible. What they found instead was confusing. White wooden barracks stood neatly arranged behind barbed wire fences. A paved path led toward the administrative building. Even the guards, though stoic, did not sneer or shout. The absence of hatred was disorienting. At the far end of the compound, a tall man in a wool officer's coat stood watching from the steps of the main building. Major Allen Thompson, commander of Millsfield Camp, was a veteran of both military protocol and human contradiction. He had fought in the trenches of the Great War and now found himself overseeing prisoners of a very different kind. He believed in discipline, but also in dignity. It was a hard balance, especially in a war that had torn so much apart. Among the women was Marta Derling, a former schoolteacher from Leipzig. At 31, she had learned how to command attention without raising her voice. Though not officially the leader of the group, her posture and composure made her the natural anchor. She carried no weapons now, only a small cloth bundle tied with string. Yet she walked with the memory of structure, the presence of someone who once stood in front of chalkboards and recited lines of Goethe. Inside the processing center, everything ran with mechanical efficiency. Forms were typed, photographs were taken, physical exams administered. The Red Cross emblem was visible in several offices, a silent assurance that the Geneva Convention was being observed. The women remained quiet but watchful. No one cried. No one spoke out. The fear had not vanished. It had simply tucked itself beneath the surface, like ice under snow. By late afternoon, the women were led to their designated barracks. Each was assigned a cot, a pillow, 2 wool blankets, and a small footlocker. The buildings were heated by coal stoves, modest but functional. The air inside was tinged with the scent of pine and iron. No decorations, no comfort, just structure. But even that structure felt safer than the unknown they had braced for. As dusk fell, the camp bell rang for evening meal. The same women who had arrived in silence now filed into the mess hall, unsure what to expect. They were hungry, tired, and cautious. In that moment, none of them knew that the next few minutes would ignite a tension not born of violence or ideology, but of something far simpler and far more human: bread. Or rather, what they would come to believe was a mockery of it. The mess hall buzzed with the low hum of clinking trays and quiet footsteps as the newly arrived women entered single file. The room was clean, if sparse, with long wooden tables stretching the length of the space and a lingering scent of boiled vegetables and military starch. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold glow on the dull silverware and tin cups laid out for each prisoner. The women glanced around, exchanging hesitant looks, unsure whether to relax or remain on guard. Hunger, however, had a way of overriding suspicion. In the kitchen, Sam Duval moved with the practiced grace of someone who had prepared thousands of meals. A tall, black man in his early 40s, Sam had learned to cook in his grandmother's kitchen in Louisiana, where food was never just food. It was memory, ritual, and love. He had spent the afternoon baking something special, believing it might offer the new arrivals a small gesture of kindness. Golden squares of cornbread, lightly browned at the edges and brushed with melted butter, sat stacked in large trays. To Sam, it was more than a side dish. It was a piece of home. As the first woman approached the serving line, Sam offered her a warm smile and placed a portion of soup on her tray, followed by a slice of cornbread. She looked down at the unfamiliar yellow block with open confusion. The texture was odd, the color unsettling, and the aroma sweet, earthy, unfamiliar. She raised an eyebrow, said nothing, and stepped aside. One by one, the others received the same serving, each reacting with subtle expressions of amusement, curiosity, or quiet disdain. It was Marta who broke the silence. She held up the piece of cornbread between two fingers, examined it, and turned to the others with a crooked smile. "This isn't even bread," she said, first in German, then again in English. Her tone was laced with bemusement, not cruelty, but the room caught fire with laughter. The comment struck a nerve among the group, releasing tension through shared mockery. Laughter echoed off the walls, light at first, then louder, more unified, more biting. The American guards standing along the walls stiffened slightly, their expressions unreadable. The noise, though not violent, carried a strange edge. Sam, who had been wiping down the counter near the doorway, looked up and froze. His smile vanished. He understood enough German to know what had been said, but even without words, the message was clear. They were laughing at his offering, at the food that had fed generations of the poor, of the South, of his own family. The laughter wasn't meant to be cruel, but it struck deep. Cornbread, to Sam, was survival food. It was the answer to hunger when wheat was too expensive or too scarce. It was what his great-grandmother baked during the Depression, what his mother fed him when all they had was cornmeal and a splash of buttermilk. It was a symbol of resilience, of making do, of turning scraps into something warm and nourishing. And now it had become a joke. The incident rippled through the camp within hours. By the next morning, cornbread was gone from the menu. In its place were slices of bland, commissary white bread, uniform, tasteless, and safe. Sam returned to his routines, moving mechanically through the motions of feeding 100 mouths. But the spark was gone. His hands, once expressive with pride, now moved like parts of a machine.
Die männlichen women noticed den change too. The mess hall, once cautiously curious, became stiff and silent. Die guards no longer exchanged polite nods. Der gap zwischen captor und captive, once showing signs of subtle narrowing, widened again. Und do das Inzident hat lastet nur mehr als ein paar Minuten, its effects waren langriechend. Ein Moment of Lachen hat Bild einen invisiblen Wall höher, als Barbedwire eher konnte.
The days that followed settled into a pattern of cold efficiency. The women woke to the sound of the camp bell, stood for roll call beneath gray skies, ate their meals in silence, and returned to their quarters before dusk. The early winter winds blew stronger each day, rattling the thin windows and seeping through the seams of their uniforms. Conversation among the prisoners became minimal, subdued by a growing awareness that something invisible had shifted. What had once been cautious tolerance now felt like quiet punishment. Marta began to feel it most sharply. Where the guards once offered short greetings or lingered an extra second to explain a rule, now they simply passed orders without eye contact. She caught glimpses of them watching with unreadable expressions, their former curiosity replaced by a kind of distant disappointment. Even the mess hall had changed. The air inside, once filled with the scent of spices and warmth, now smelled sterile, as if something living had been scrubbed away.
Sam moved like a shadow. He ladled soup without looking up, distributed bread without variation, wiped down surfaces as if polishing away emotion. He still prepared the meals properly, still fulfilled his duty, but the food felt hollow, stripped of the subtle care that had once made it more than sustenance. The cornbread incident had been brief, but it had left a mark he couldn't quite erase. To him, it wasn't just about the bread. It was about rejection, of his story, his identity, his history. At night, Marta lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling while memories clawed their way to the surface. Her mother's voice echoed from another life. Gratitude is the first form of civility. She remembered how, after the First World War, they'd eaten scraps and bitter flour. Her father had once wept over a piece of stale bread, grateful it was there at all. She had forgotten that lesson in the mess hall, and the weight of it now settled like ash in her chest. The other women began to sense it too. Whispers in the barracks turned to reflection, not defiance. What had once been a shared joke now felt like a mistake they couldn't undo. They had mocked something unfamiliar, something that had been offered as kindness, not command. And in doing so, they had closed a door that might not easily reopen.
Major Thompson watched it unfold with quiet frustration. He had hoped this camp would demonstrate a better version of wartime captivity, one grounded in dignity. But he could not force empathy, nor could he undo offense. The separation between guards and prisoners remained orderly on paper, but spiritually it had frayed. Respect had been offered, then refused. Now it waited in limbo, uncertain whether it would return.
Outside, the first snow fell, thin flakes drifting across the fence line like tiny messages from a silent sky. The camp was quiet, save for the wind and the shuffle of boots on frozen ground. Inside the kitchen, Sam wiped his hands on his apron and stared at the empty baking tray that once held cornbread. He thought of his grandmother and the way she used to say, "You can tell a lot about people by how they treat your food." He turned off the stove and walked into the darkened corridor without a word. It began quietly, with a cough that echoed across the barracks during lights out. At first, no one paid much attention. After all, the air was cold and dry, and the thin blankets didn't offer much protection against the creeping chill. But within 2 days, Annika, the youngest of the German women, was feverish and weak, her skin clammy and pale. Her breathing grew shallow, and she stopped eating altogether. The others watched in anxious silence as the camp medic was summoned. The diagnosis was clear and immediate: influenza, worsened by exhaustion and poor immunity after weeks of stress. The doctor ordered fluids, rest, and warmth, but there was little more he could do. Infirmary conditions were basic, and medicine was scarce. Annika lay in a narrow cot, trembling, her eyes flickering between sleep and delirium. Marta sat by her side at night, guilt growing in the silence. Word of Annika's condition reached the kitchen by morning. Sam paused when he heard, the ladle in his hand frozen mid-motion. He thought of his own daughter, long since grown, and of a winter when she had almost died from a fever much like this. His memory drifted to Montgomery, to the cramped apartment and his grandmother's warm, calloused hands. She had made something then, a bowl of cornbread crumbled into hot milk with honey, simple but somehow soothing. Moved by instinct more than logic, Sam stepped away from the soup pots and quietly began preparing the old family remedy. He measured the cornmeal by touch, not by spoon. He added a bit of salt, a dash of sweetness, and stirred it until it thickened to the right texture. Then he ladled it into a ceramic bowl, covered it with a clean towel, and walked it across the snow-dusted camp to the infirmary. Inside, Marta looked up as Sam entered, unsure what to expect. He said nothing, only set the bowl down and pulled up a chair beside Annika's cot. Her eyes fluttered open as the scent reached her: warm milk,
butter, and something softer underneath. Sam dipped a spoon into the mixture, lifted it to her lips, and waited. Slowly, she accepted it, letting the warmth spread through her throat. She managed a weak smile, then another spoonful.
Marta watched in silence, her throat tightening. This was not a soldier and a prisoner. This was a man offering comfort to a sick child, as any father might. The gesture pierced the cold that had lingered since the mess hall incident. It wasn't grand or official. It was personal, deeply human, and for the first time in weeks, the barracks held something other than tension. Later that night, Annika's fever broke. Her breathing steadied, and the color returned to her cheeks. The other women gathered quietly outside the infirmary, whispering prayers in German, their voices tentative but full of hope. Marta remained seated beside the bed, the empty bowl resting in her lap like a sacred object. That simple meal had done what no speech could have accomplished. It had reminded them all what grace looked like. In the kitchen, Sam returned to his station, but something had shifted. The walls didn't feel as heavy. The silence didn't feel as permanent. He opened the pantry, looked at the bag of cornmeal, and set it gently on the counter. Not as a cook, as someone who had given a piece of his past and watched it be accepted. The recovery of Annika marked a turning point, quiet but undeniable. Word of what Sam had done spread quickly among the women, though none of them spoke of it in front of the guards. They whispered in the barracks, not just about the food, but about the look on his face, the way he had held the spoon, the tenderness behind the gesture. Marta found herself thinking about it constantly, replaying the scene over and over. It had been more than kindness. It had been a bridge. 2 days later, Marta approached the kitchen alone. She wore her gray uniform and her winter coat, hands tucked deep into her sleeves. Sam was cleaning the preparation table, not expecting visitors. When he looked up, she didn't speak right away. Then, in deliberate English, she said, "Teach me how to make it, the bread." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes held something vulnerable, almost pleading. Sam didn't answer immediately. He watched her for a moment, then nodded once and motioned for her to come inside. He gathered the ingredients without explanation: cornmeal, flour, salt, baking powder, milk, and eggs. Marta stood beside him, waiting for instructions, her posture straight but her breath shallow. It was the first time since arriving that she had crossed into the kitchen not as a prisoner, but as a student. They worked in silence. Sam showed her how to measure by weight in the palm of the hand, not just by cups. How to feel the texture of the batter, thick but not stiff. How to fold the ingredients gently, never overmix. Marta followed carefully, absorbing each motion, each detail. Her hands were used to chalk and paper, not warm dough and wooden spoons, but they learned quickly. As the cornbread baked, the room filled with that familiar scent, rich, sweet, slightly nutty. Marta closed her eyes briefly, allowing it to wash over her. She hadn't realized how deeply memory could be stored in smell. For a moment, she thought of her mother's kitchen in Leipzig, where rye bread cooled on wooden racks and war had not yet shattered the world. It felt like touching something lost. When the bread was done, Sam sliced it slowly and handed her a piece. She didn't hesitate this time. She took a bite, chewed, and swallowed, letting the warmth settle deep in her chest. There was no laughter, no confusion, no resistance, just understanding. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it in every sense. That evening, she returned to the barracks and shared what she had learned: the recipe, the method, the meaning. A few of the other women asked if they could try too. Soon, cooking lessons became a quiet tradition, not officially sanctioned, not discussed outside the mess hall, but real and growing. Sam began to notice small things: the women greeting guards with shy English, Notes in careful handwriting pinned near the kitchen. More salt? Very good, thank you. The walls of silence were thinning, not because anyone ordered it, but because someone had offered bread, and this time it had been received not with laughter, but with respect. By early December, Millsfield Camp stood blanketed in snow, its wooden structures softened under white weight and silence. The routines continued: roll call at dawn, meals at scheduled times, strict lights out. But something had changed beneath the surface. Where there had once been guarded indifference, now there were signs of warmth, hesitant conversations, cautious laughter, and shared glances that didn't avert too quickly. The memory of Annika's illness lingered, but not as tragedy, instead as a moment of reckoning that made something deeper possible. Small acts, once impossible, began to take root. When the first blizzard hit on the 18th, it came without mercy. Wind howled across the plains, tearing through the fences and pushing snow into every crack of the barracks. By evening, the camp's heating systems began to fail, pipes frozen solid, stoves unable to hold the temperature. Emergency protocols activated, and all personnel, guards and prisoners alike, were moved into the mess hall, the only building large enough and warm enough to keep them alive through the night. Blankets were distributed without rank. Position ceased to matter. The large space was crowded, dimly lit by improvised braziers crafted from metal drums. Shadows flickered across the walls. The women huddled with the guards near the fires, breath visible in the cold. Coffee was passed around from thermoses normally reserved for officers. German prisoners offered scarves and extra socks to American soldiers. No one spoke much, but the silence was no longer bitter, it was shared. The storm outside made no distinction between nationality or uniform. It was Liesel, her voice still fragile from her recent illness, who began to hum first. The melody was unmistakable, Stille Nacht. Her voice, hesitant and trembling, floated above the hush. One by one, others joined in. First, Marta, then a guard, quietly at first, in English, Silent Night. More voices layered in, hesitant but sincere, until the entire mess hall was filled with a harmony that rose above the roar of wind outside. For a moment, it was not a camp. It was a sanctuary. Sam stood in the back, arms crossed, listening. He hadn't planned to sing, but when the chorus reached its softest moment, he added his voice, deep, steady, warm. Across the firelight, Marta met his eyes and held his gaze. The memory of that first meal, of the laughter, of the distance between them, seemed to melt in the heat of shared humanity. It was not erasure, it was acknowledgement. When the singing ended, silence returned, but it was filled with something different now. Marta rose, walked past the huddled bodies, and stood at the entrance to the kitchen. She paused, then turned to Sam. "Please," she said softly, her English careful and sincere, "teach me again. Let's make bread." Her voice was not a command, nor a plea. It was an offering. He nodded and followed her inside. The kitchen was cold but familiar. Sam lit the burners and pulled out the ingredients. Marta rolled up her sleeves without being asked. Together they began the old rhythm, measuring, stirring, pouring. This time there were no barriers, just flour, cornmeal, hands working side by side. As they baked, the warmth returned, not just to the oven, but to the air around them. That night, the scent of cornbread once again filled the mess hall. People sat close, eating with their hands, no need for ceremony. It was not a feast, it was not peace, but it was something close, a gesture that said, we are still here, we are still human. And sometimes forgiveness starts not with words, but with bread that no longer needs to explain itself.